Hi, KJ. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Hi, Jim. How are you?
All right, at my age, I'm vertical.
Good. Yes,
Yeah,
I can stand, I can still walk, so we're good.
yeah,
that's
How have you
excellent.
been?
Busy, as you might imagine. There's a lot happening.
yes. Well, that's
Well,
why we wanted to get you in here because we know a lot going on and we need some help understanding this, if there is any way to understand this kind of lunacy.
We might as well get to it. So,
let's jump in.
so, so KJ, KJ, your article of March 1st this year that can be found in Counterpunch is frightening, but that's what you do. You write frightening articles. And so the title is After Ukraine, US readies transnational kill chain for Taiwan proxy war. And in it, you start off talking about something called Link 16. So could you start by talking about what this kill chain is and then why Link 16 is so important and how much it's costing the US taxpayer? And then we'll just reach out and talk about just about anything.
Or just give us kind of the backdrop to how this has all come about.
Yeah. First I want to apologize if I sound alarmist or if I sound like I'm trying to frighten anybody. But, I'm simply calling it as I see it. I see the place happening and I'm calling it as I see it. And I think that there's really, really dangerous escalations happening. They're not getting any better. Nothing is, de-escalating. And I think it's really important for us, at least those of us in the peace community who care about the future, to be aware of what is happening. I think, that's, and then regarding Link 16 and the kill chain, the term, and it's not my term, it's not my language, it's the Pentagon's language. They refer to it as a transnational kill chain. That's what they're preparing for China. And Link 16 is the key element. It's what's called a tactical data link. It allows militaries to communicate with each other and with other militaries. Essentially, it allows, for example, if you have radar located in one place, you can send that information to, the rear where it gets processed, and then that can send messages out to missile and, Air Force and other tactical and operational troops, and they all coordinate. It's a little bit like this. When you buy your smartphone, um, it's just an expensive paperweight until you put the SIM card in it. When you put in the SIM card, then it becomes something that can do all kinds of things. Link 16 is like putting the SIM card into a military. Essentially, it allows the entire military to communicate with itself, all of its sensors, all of its radars, all of its battle tactical, operational. It gives a complete and total tactical and operational map of the battlefield, of the theater of war. And the reason why it's important that why Link 16 is significant is that it is the NATO tactical data network. In other words, it allows Taiwan's military to be connected to the US military, to South Korean military, to Japanese military, to Australian military, to European NATO military. And so they all get the same common tactical and operational picture, and they can wage war together. This is why I say that it's very dangerous, and it shows how advanced the plans are for war. Just as the United States was planning to bring Ukraine into NATO, and that continual escalation led to the Ukraine war, and they did give Link 16 to Ukraine as well. The same thing is happening right now for Taiwan Island. In other words, Taiwan is fully in the process of being turned into the next Ukraine, There is a set of alliances that are being built that look like an Asian NATO, which is preparing for war, as they say, preparing a transnational kill chain. And the U.S. and Taiwan has just elected its own Zelensky. That person is William Lai.
So go a little bit further into Taiwan electing its own Zelensky, because I know it got a response from China. They conducted all kinds of military operations that they called punishment, or at least somebody called it punishment. So
Yeah, the Chinese are very, very upset about this, and they did an exercise of encirclement around Taiwan Island. Once again, let's emphasize that the Chinese consider Taiwan to be their territory. Legally, it is their territory. From the standpoint of international law, according to the UN, it is their territory. The United States recognizes Taiwan as Chinese territory. This is the three communiques, one China policy. And guess what? The Taiwan Constitution itself recognizes itself as part of China. There's no such thing as an independent state of Taiwan ROC. That doesn't exist. Even the ROC Constitution itself refers to themselves as the Taiwan area, or more obnoxiously, the free area of China, of Greater China. So inside this situation, it's been understood that China wants peaceful reunification with Taiwan province because Taiwan was stolen from China, stolen by the Japanese when they invaded China, and in 1895, the Sino-Japanese War. Stolen as war booty. And then for the next 50 years, it was weaponized as a platform of attack against China because it is the most convenient and the closest island to the main Chinese southern coast. And so it was a very, very important colony, a Japanese colony. And in 1945, Japan surrendered. And in the surrender documents, it said that it would uphold the Cairo and the Potsdam declarations. The Cairo and the Potsdam declarations are essentially the international agreements that say that Japan must return all of its colonies that it stole through war to their original owner, including Taiwan Island. Taiwan Island is specifically mentioned that it must be returned to China. Okay. So the international understanding is that Taiwan is a integral part of China. Now, what happened in this kind of historical disturbance was that the PRC, the communists, beat the fascist KMT in a civil war that lasted for 3 decades, and essentially they won. And there was a contingent that escaped to Taiwan Island and decamped there and created a rump state and had the conceit that they were going to take back all of China. You know, they just needed a little bit of time to regroup. It's not, and the reason why they were able to escape to Taiwan and to establish themselves was, of course, because the United States sided with the fascist KMT. Okay, it's not unlike South Korea was split, not unlike South Vietnam was split. Taiwan is essentially South China. It's the rump state of South China that the US wanted to weaponize against the People's Republic. And it did that for decades. It waged war, both dirty war and kinetic war against China from Taiwan Island until the late 60s, early 70s. And it also used Taiwan as a key base of subversion all around Asia. I don't know if people know this, but essentially Taiwan Island was the clearinghouse for global fascism and global Nazism. And it was aligned with South Africa, and it was aligned with Israel, and the three of them all together, they fed dirty counterinsurgencies, for example, all over Africa and Latin America. That's why Taiwan's key allies to this day are former Latin American dictatorships. So that's a whole another piece of the story. We can go into that later. But all of this is to say, Taiwan has always been used by the United States first as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, and then it was turned into this kind of gray zone hedge against China, a little bit sort of a dormant stay behind weapon against China. And then with the Biden administration, which was prefigured by the Trump administration, they essentially declared that they no longer believed in the one China policy. Okay. Now, when you say that you no longer believe in the one China policy, you are essentially saying that you're essentially declaring war against China. Okay. Currently, the United States is hacking Taiwan to the teeth with weapons, very, very deadly weapons, both asymmetric weapons and its highly suspected tactical nuclear weapons. It is giving them all kinds of missiles, and it is also stationing troops inside of Taiwan proper, including on some of the small islands that are close to China. For example, in Jinmen Island. Jinmen Island is about 3 miles from the Chinese coastline, and you could literally swim. In fact, they encourage seniors to swim that channel every year. It's so close you could swim the backstroke and come out and not be tired. And they have placed U.S. special forces on Jinmen Island within visual distance, sniper distance, mortar distance of one of China's main cities. So this is the level of escalation that we are seeing. And
we've got troops on that little island.
yes, it's probably several hundred. Not any troops, they're Green Beret.
Good
Okay.
gracious.
So,
Okay.
so essentially, we're saying to China, we have placed the tripwire right up against your nose. You're not even going to be able to get the ball onto the court. We're doing this full court press. So don't even think of getting out of the end zone. You stay right there. So this is how extraordinarily belligerent the United States is behaving in that region. And more recently, what happened was that so there is the KMT and there is the newer DPP. The DPP has held power for 8 years, and they won the most recent election in January of 2024, and they got another 4-year term. Now, the DPP is the secessionist party. They're the party that wants to secede. And once again, let me emphasize that secession for any country is a very, very risky proposition, right? I mean, the US went to war. The bloodiest war in US history was the Civil War, when the South wanted to secede. If you can imagine, the Civil War ended, and then a group of Confederates went to Galveston Island and then declared themselves to be the United States of America. And then China started to give the people, these troops on Galveston Island, started to give them weapons, and then started to place PLA troops on Galveston Island and prepared them for war. I think this would be a problem, right?
I think it would.
It would, right? And that's exactly what's happened. Remember, Taiwan is 90 miles away from the Chinese mainland. It is where all of China's industrial wealth is. All of China's commercial wealth is along that coastal seaboard. And if that is turned back into a US base, as it was for decades, with possibly tactical nuclear weapons, that's something that cannot be tolerated on the part of China. But what happened was, the DPP was elected, and the person who ran was William Lai, and his vice presidential candidate was Louise Xiao. And if you think it's strange that they have American names, it's not a coincidence because they're American quislings. In fact, in the case of Louise Xiao, she is the darling of the US conservative class in the United States because she was the de facto ambassador to Washington, where she was, building relations with all of these neocons in Washington. But more than that, she was actually an American citizen. Her mother is American. She was born in Japan, raised in New Jersey. She's a Jersey girl. And then she lived in Manhattan. And then she, kind of took off her American citizenship so she could be placed into power. So, there's clearly some, very clear, shaping of the political environment going on. But both of them are very, very close to Washington. They're essentially the Washington designated leaders. And when William Lai was running for the presidency, he spoke a little bit like Zelensky. It's all about peace. We just want peace. We just want peace. We just want things stable. We want the status quo. We want peace. And then between the January, when the election was done, and his inauguration very recently in April, just about a week ago, during that period, Laura Rosenberger, who is the head of the AIT, she's the chairperson of the American Institute in Taiwan, that's the de facto embassy. It's essentially where the US controls the Taiwan politicians. She visited multiple times. And there was the hope and expectation around the world, but certainly in China, that she was talking to him and talking him down from his radical secessionist position, which would be a trigger for war. During this 4-month period, there were multiple meetings between William Lai and Rosenberger and the US deep state. And then William Lai gives this speech, and it's highly anticipated. And he essentially declares Taiwan to be independent. Okay, he declares secession. So that is a red flag right off there. Let me tell you a few things about this notion of independence or secession. The Taiwan Constitution, once again, says that Taiwan or the Taiwan area is part of China. That's in their constitution. The second piece of it is that if they want to be independent, they have to get the votes in the legislature. And they don't have the votes. The DPP does not have the votes to secede because first, William Lai was elected first past the post with only 40% of the vote and only 28% of the electorate. So some people voted for them because they believed his lies. But remember, the vast majority, 60% of the voting population and 72% of the electorate are opposed to his policies. It doesn't matter. The US wants to trigger a war, and they're using William Lai as the Zelensky to trigger this. And so the Chinese response has been to, send a strong message, both verbally and militarily. They've encircled the island, and they're sending the message to Taiwan Island: don't try this because, we don't have to invade you, but we can do a blockade. And it's true, they could very easily do a blockade. Taiwan has about 10 days of natural gas. It's an island. Most of their trade is with the People's Republic of China. Most of their supplies they get from the People's Republic of China. And they have, 10 days to 2 weeks worth of natural gas. So China is saying that we can do a blockade. Please don't do this. And in the Shangri-La summit, Li Dongjun, who is the Chinese Minister of Defense, said that the secessionists would be nailed to the pillar of shame of history if they continue going down this path, and that they will self-destruct. And there were some very, very strong messages to the United States as well. Those people who are aiding and abetting, the foreign people who are interfering in our internal affairs, you can also expect a very, very strong response. So both rhetorically and also militarily, we can see there's a very, very strong response on the part of China. And it seems like the United States is quite simply oblivious. They simply want to keep going ahead, keep provoking. They want to keep driving into the paint to see if they can draw the foul. And so this is why this is such a dangerous moment right now.
Does the PPP have a majority in the legislature?
No, that's another piece, which is another very interesting dynamic, is they lost the legislature. And so the legislature is trying to pass some new legislation that will create some checks and balances against the executive. Now, Taiwan, the US likes to claim that Taiwan is some kind of model democracy. It's not. Nothing of the sort. It did not have a democratic election for president until 1996. Before that, it was one of the worst dictatorships on the planet. As I said, it was a clearinghouse for global fascism. It was a major supporter of Israel and South Africa, and it still supports the genocide in Gaza. So that gives you a sense of where they stand politically. But it has what currently is called a super presidential system and a first past the post electoral system. First past the post means as soon as one party gets more than any other party, you win. Okay. Now there's no runoff. That's generally considered a signal of, the US generally considers when it sees this in a country a signal of an authoritarian state. Because, it means you can win the election with 28% of the electorate, which is what happened here. 40% of the voting public, 28% of the electorate. That's how they won. Okay, so they have absolutely no mandate. But the US likes to claim, as it claims about Israel or any other, major quisling, that it is some kind of model democracy in the area. In fact, it calls it the only democracy in East Asia, and it proves that the Chinese can have democracy too. Okay, which is absurd. It's absolutely ridiculous. But they have a super presidential system, which means that the president has extraordinary powers. They get to appoint the prime minister, they appoint the judiciary, and ordinarily there is an organ which Sun Yat-sen imagined would counterbalance against the executive, called the control yuan. But that control yuan has essentially been defanged. It's like the GAO, the office of, it's the organization that is supposed to monitor and inspect and offer checks and balances against the executive. That has been completely neutered by the DPP. In fact, Tsai Ing-wen, the previous president, placed her top advisor as the head of the control yuan. And so it's completely corrupt. It would be like appointing your grandmother to audit you, right? I mean, it's just kind of absurdity. And so what the KMT and the other opposition party, the TPP, have been trying to do is they've been trying to pass, or they actually have passed, legislation that allows the legislature to audit and monitor the executive. It also requires the executive to give a State of the Nation speech once a year. And it also gives them the capacity to call witnesses and compel testimony. Okay. These are not extraordinary powers. This is essentially what the US legislature does in, its balancing against the executive. Now, this is being portrayed in the Western press as some incredible violation of ROC's democratic process, and that China is behind this, and it's trying to, overthrow a legitimate, government, and et cetera, et cetera. It's simply absurd. And there have been some astroturfed protests on the ground. Lots of young people, going out onto the streets and saying, we want to protect our democracy, even though it's exactly the opposite, because it's trying to prevent checks and balances in a democracy. So there's some, real information warfare going on, and a lot of astroturf protests that are being catapulted in the Western media propaganda sphere. So we'll see. But I just want to highlight that essentially right now, Taiwan has its Zelensky, that's William Lai. It has its Victoria Nuland, that's Laura Rosenberger. It is being prepared militarily as if it were Ukraine. And there seems to be no brakes on this train.
And I know you said in your article, it effectively prepares Taiwan to be used as the spear tip and trigger of a multinational war offensive against China. So that goes back to the killing chain. So just name the countries that are part of this killing chain.
Yeah. So essentially, they're Japan. Japan has one of the most powerful navies on the planet. It's essentially gutted its peace constitution. So it's prepared for war, and it's prepared to go to war on the Korean Peninsula or over Taiwan or in the East China Sea or in the South China Sea. This has been the dream of the LDP and their unrepentant militarists since 1955 or since 1945. But they've essentially built themselves back into a military force that will be a subcontractor for US violence and aggression in the Pacific. And if you have any recollection of what Japan did to East Asia during World War II and before, then this is a thought that should, send terror through, everybody on the planet. So you have Japan. Soon it will have the third largest military budget on the planet. Okay, so that tells you how serious they are.
Mm-hmm.
They've also, and the Financial Times just recently pointed out that they've turned the golf courses on some of the islands into missile bases. And you know that the ruling elite are really serious about going to war when they turn their golf courses into, launching pads. The Japanese and the US, they love their golf courses, right?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So there's Japan, and then there's Korea. And I've said this before, but Korea is very, very important because it is already halfway, it's kind of the doorstep or the bridgehead onto the Chinese continent, that area. And the US has operational control over South Korea's military. That is, it has complete and total control over their military, their material, their weapons, their bases, the moment they decide they want that. And that is 600,000 South Korean troops armed to the teeth, trained to a very, very high level, plus 3.1 million reserve troops. It's an extraordinary military force. It's the largest military manpower on the planet. And the US gets that for free, which is an extraordinary kind of moral hazard. So there's Japan, there's Korea, and the US, and put together they're called the JACUS alliance, or I call them the JACUS alliance, but it's a trilateral alliance. And then there's also JAFUS, that's Japan, Philippines, US alliance. Apparently there's also JAWFUS now, that's Japan, Australia, Philippines, US alliance. Of course, we all know about AUKUS, that's Australia, UK, US alliance.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the Quad, which apparently hasn't been working so well because India was not coming along. And so they turned it into the Squad, which is Japan, Australia, US, UK. So they're constantly building out what they refer to as mini-lateral alliances. And they want to stitch all of these mini-lateral alliances together into a pan-Asian NATO, so that they can wage total war across the entire island chain and across the entire Pacific. As I said, this is the third offset. They want a theater of war which is as expanded as possible in order to be able to do dispersed attacks and to nullify China's capacity to defend itself. So here you have very, very large coalition. Essentially, this is a multinational coalition kill chain that the U.S. has stitched together.
So why? Good Lord. Why do this? Why is the United States? I mean, we don't have a good track record on these things. So what are we thinking? What's our motives?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are many different ways to answer this. It's the $64,000 question. I mean, why does the US constantly go to war? It has only been at peace for 16 years in the entire history of its, nearly 250-year history, right? It's constantly at war. Why is the US always going to war? And what could it possibly gain? And on the surface, people will say things, well, it's the military-industrial complex. It's the, these are the people who benefit. They want constant war. But they don't actually want or need kinetic war. They just want the threat of war. But this is a different animal. It's not simply war profiteering that's going on. There are deep ideological and geostrategic considerations involved. If you go back to 1992, the Defense Planning Guidance document, you can see that the ruling imperial elite, the neocons, essentially were planning for total planetary domination. They believed it was the end of history, that the US was the unipolar global hegemon, the boss of the world, and it should keep it that way, and it should do anything and take any measure in order to preserve that power. And we saw that with, what the violence and the tragedy in the Middle East, but also even back as early as the late 90s and early 2000s, they were preparing for war against China. Now, there were schools of thought vis-a-vis China. One school of thought, and this was, the early Clinton administration, was that essentially China, we can bring it into the capitalist system. We'll essentially absorb it into the capitalist system like we did with the Soviet Union. We'll balkanize it, we'll, privatize it, and we'll just turn it into a tenant farmer on the capitalist plantation. And for a moment there, it looked like it was sort of getting in that direction because US companies were making a killing exploiting, Chinese labor and industry. There was a second school of thought, which was that China would collapse, that it was essentially a Potemkin state, and it was like the Soviet Union on its last legs, and it would essentially collapse. So we didn't have to do anything too drastic. We just keep on liberalizing, and as it liberalizes, the regime will change. And there are many people at the highest levels of the US government which will tell you that our engagement with China was a regime change plan. We wanted to change it. We wanted to pull a Soviet Union on it. It was either going to be absorbed or it was going to be destroyed. That was the theory. There was a third group, and these are the neocons. They said China is probably not going to be destroyed and it's going to stay communist, and therefore we need to give it a little push down the stairs. And this was, the people around the certain elements of the neocon class who were tied into the blue team that were anti-China. And these were old China hawks that really had inherited their grudges from the McCarthy era and the Cold War and 1949. Okay. So you have these three groups. And something strange happens in 2008. Do you remember what happened in 2008?
Obama.
The meltdown.
The fiscal meltdown.
Exactly. So the entire capitalist financial system melted down, because this is what happens when you hyper financialize a capitalist economy. A capitalist economies, as they develop, become hyper financialized. Nobody's producing anything useful or productive. They're essentially betting on bets that are betting on other bets, right? And so everybody's simply claiming money, but nothing useful is being produced. So this is the kind of extreme hyper financialization that the U.S. government and the U.S. System runs on. And it does that through constant extraction from the productive global south, both its resources and its labor. And if you look at, for example, the unfair trade or the unfair exchange that happened, for example, from 1960 to the current moment, you can see that it's in the order, depending on how you do the calculation, of about $62 trillion, about $2 trillion a year from the poorest countries on the planet, including China. Or if you calculate the opportunity costs in as well, it's about $162 trillion, which is to say it's, close to, $3 trillion a year sucked out of the poorest countries on the planet. Okay. So there's this constant unequal exchange and this constant extraction happening from the global south. And what the neocons noticed is that China had broken free of this extractive system, that essentially it had run off the plantation, that it was building out its own country, it was become wealthy and powerful. And not only was it becoming wealthy and powerful, but it was developing on its own terms. Its development was not becoming more Western or more capitalist. It was becoming more Chinese with Chinese socialism, Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics. Mm-hmm. And it was becoming, it is currently the largest economy by purchasing power parity already. And at the same time, in 2008, the global financial system collapsed. The Western capitalist financial system collapsed. And so this sent alarm bells through the ruling imperial elite. Essentially, it told them that China is not going to be absorbed, but not only is it not going to be absorbed, it's not even going to collapse. In fact, we are the ones collapsing. And therefore, we can no longer rely purely on this, notion of destiny or, end of history or financial absorption or liberal capitalist ideological supremacy. We have to resort to stronger medicine. And that's when the daggers came out. And that's when they started to plan for war. And there's an explicit doctrine of war, I've mentioned this before, called air-sea battle, that was commissioned out of the Office of Net Assessment and then written up by CSBA, which is a Pentagon affiliated procurement and strategy think tank. And they drafted this doctrine of war, air-sea battle, which is its adaptation of air-land battle. Air-land battle was the doctrine of war against the Soviet Union. It's a doctrine of total war. And air-land battle itself comes from the Yom Kippur War. It was the Israeli doctrine of war against Syria and Egypt. Essentially, it's a very, very aggressive form of attack. You decapitate your enemies, you attack. These are deep strategic attacks. It's battle extended in time and space against your enemy. And luckily, air-land battle was never used against the Soviet Union because it collapsed, but it was used in all subsequent US wars. In fact, we know air-land battle by its colloquial term, which is shock and awe. So as the US prepared, as the US was using shock and awe against Kosovo, against Iraq, against Afghanistan, it was also preparing shock and awe for China in the form of air-sea battle. And air-sea battle was formally, drafted, and it was released probably around 2011, 2012. But we know that the work on it was being done on it for years and years before. And of course, we don't know what's fully in it. We can only surmise, but we can guess what it is based on its progenitor and the language that it alludes to. There's no public version. I mean, there's a very small set of public disclosures, but nobody knows what is in the classified version. But so air-sea battle was planned for China, formal doctrine of war released, and then the US also released this doctrine of encirclement called the pivot to Asia, or the Pacific pivot. This was Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. They declared that they were essentially going to encircle China and contain it and roll it back. And then there was also something called the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a plan to exclude China from the Pacific economy, as if China were not in the Pacific. So this kind of complete, shunning of China, and they expected that to bring it down. It didn't. Donald Trump didn't sign the TPP, but at the time that they were building the TPP, it was clear that it was designed to degrade China economically. In fact, the Secretary of Defense referred to it as more important than an aircraft carrier group in vis-a-vis, China. So then Trump came up with his own sanctions, and then these had been followed up and amplified and added on to by Joe Biden. And so what we see currently in the current moment is not only are there specific plans of war, there is very specific shaping of the theater of war for battle, including the pre-positioning of weapons, materiel, and troops all along the first island chain. You can see the alliances being built. You can see the exercises have an intensity that is kind of unheard of before. In South Korea, 200 days of military exercises last year. They were rehearsing tactical and strategic nuclear attacks. More recently, the South Koreans and the US have been rehearsing capturing and transferring prisoners of war. Okay. Now, I don't know if you've been in a military exercise or even if you're in war, the US usually improvises its POW strategy. The fact that they're actually rehearsing POW exercises tells you how granular and how detailed these exercises are. So once again, we can see that there's constant hybrid war, all domain spectrum war, information warfare, economic warfare, lawfare, political warfare, diplomatic warfare, but also very, very granular military exercises that speak to a tremendous level of preparation and determination. And we know that, the window, according to Admiral, there's General Davidson, General Minahan said that it would happen, the war would happen by 2025. And Admiral Davidson said that war would happen by 2027. But the question is not if or whether we will go to war, but when and how. And we even have, dates penciled in for war. So I think that gives you a sense of how advanced these plans.
And in your article, we have not precluded first use of nuclear weapons.
Exactly. The U.S. Nuclear doctrine is what's called it's called a counterforce doctrine, which essentially is the idea that you strike first. If you go to war and if it's necessary, you think it's strategically important, you strike first. And the idea is that you strike fast and you strike first, and then you gamble that you have knocked out enough of their nuclear capacity to be able to intercept anything that's launched in retaliation.
That won't work.
It won't work, but this is how they're thinking, right? Yeah. And essentially, they're willing to take the risk of ending the planet in order to maintain their elite hegemony.
And it's all about maintaining the hegemony.
Maintaining the power and privilege. Yeah. As I
Yeah.
said before, they would rather end the world than end their power and privilege. Now, technically, China has a very, very small nuclear arsenal. It's somewhere in the range of 200 to 400 weapons. All of the nuclear warheads are detached from the delivery vehicle, so it does not have launch on warning. The Chinese position is that nuclear war should never be contemplated. It should never be fought. They're absolutely against nuclear war. But I think the US thinks that, because they think that way, we can play chicken and we can essentially either scare them into submission or, we can get in the sucker punch. We can get in the nuclear sucker punch, and that's how we will win.
But China's becoming friendlier with Russia.
Correct.
I don't think, and let's go with a non-nuclear exchange, but well, let me back up. We've got Ukraine. We're feeding Israel, and we're spending millions, billions here. Another war that would be supporting 3 wars. Can we do that? Or isn't this going to just bleed us dry?
Do you think they care?
Oh, never mind.
I think we're already being bled dry, right? I mean,
Yeah.
into the streets, look around you, look at the human suffering, right? Everybody's struggling. What's 60% of US families don't have $500 to their name. If they need a new set of tires or get a large parking ticket, I mean, they're done for, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, everybody's being bled dry right now, and they're pouring on millions of dollars, billions of dollars, tens, hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine. They're paying for their civil servants and their, their retirements, even as here people have given up on the idea of retirement. So, there's something extraordinarily obscene there. But, this is the state of affairs. And, once again, coming back to this notion of unequal exchange, the US the West extracts extraordinary amounts of wealth from the global South. But that extraction is based on the assumption that all of these global South still stay under the thumb of the United States and use US, dollar as the medium of exchange and et cetera, et cetera. And if they break out, it's like from the standpoint of the parasite, when the host wants to detach the parasite sees that as a threat to itself. And this is potentially what's happening with the rising of the multipolar world. The multipolar world is a negation of this extractive unipolar world where the US and Western colonial European states were the predator states that simply extracted all the wealth out of the global South. I mean, France still has colonies in the Pacific, in Melanesia, Polynesia. It still has, colonies. That's why there are these, massive, protests in New Caledonia.
Mhm.
So, so can they wage this war? The question is, should they? No, absolutely not. It's unjustifiable. Can they wage this war? I think they have deluded themselves into thinking that they can. How do they think this? Because first, the US has waged endless war, and as it racks up the costs, it puts it on the credit card, right? Puts it on the credit card, and that credit card is the US dollar. Essentially, it has the capacity to print endless amounts of US dollars. So that it just puts it on the credit card, and then it gets stuff from other countries, and it gives other countries useless paper, an IOU for useful goods. And that's how it's continually lived high on the hog. It's as Blanche Dubois said, she has always lived off the kindness of strangers. The US has always lived off, the kindness or the extraction of other countries. So, and then the other question that has to be asked is, does the US have the industrial capacity to wage war? Because one of the things that we see in the Ukraine war is that industrial capacity matters. Financialized economies cannot go to war against an industrial power because industrial capacity matters. In a war of attrition, you need to be able to produce bullets and shells and munitions and arms in order to fight. And if you've gutted your industrial capacity, how can you fight, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are two answers that the US is working on. One is it's getting its vassals to do the industrial production for it. They're talking about South Korea, Japan, and they're also trying to pull India into this. For example, they want India to produce US jet engines, for example. So, South Korea has a large military industrial complex. Hyundai, these were all, a lot of Hanwha and Hyundai, Hyundai was a subcontractor to Brown and Root during the Vietnam War, Halliburton, essentially.
Yeah.
And so long history of producing industrial military goods for the war machine. So they want Korea and Japan to do that. They want Korea to build the ships. They want to, they're preparing. If the ships are damaged in the Pacific, they've already made agreements with South Korean shipyards to fix American ships in South Korean dockyards for immediate battle repair. That's how granular these preparations are. The same thing with Japan. They expect Japan to do a lot of the military industrial preparation. And of course, the US is also trying to reshore some of these industrial capacities. And if you look at, for example, all the tech companies, they're all gathering like pigs at the trough for US military procurement. The Silicon Valley tech companies are all suckling or preparing to suckle at the teat of the military. So there's extensive industrial and economic preparation that is happening as well. In fact, foreign affairs, I think, or maybe foreign policy, said that the United States needs to shift to an industrial war footing immediately. US needs to shift to an industrial war footing immediately. And they're also saying, this is what the elites are saying to each other, we need to prepare for protracted warfare. David Nagel, I think, writing in the very high-level military journal, he's one of the brains that created the doctrine of war for Afghanistan. He says that we need to prepare for mass casualties. The US needs to prepare for 3,600 casualties a day. Not a week, not a month, not a year, 3,600 casualties a day. When we go to war with China, we will have, in his words, we will have within 2 weeks more casualties than we had in 20 years of war with Afghanistan and Iraq. Okay, and so his argument is that we need to bring back the draft in some form. He says the all-volunteer army has outlived its shelf life, and we need to prepare to reinstate some kind of draft. And so that's the view from the C-suite, from the boxes in the stadium, and then from the ground you can see extraordinary amounts of preparation for war in terms of the granular exercises, the aggressiveness of the exercises, the continuity and the nonstop tempo of the exercises. And then, if you talk to young reservists, they're telling you that they're being constantly shipped out to Hawaii, and they can't tell you why, but it's to prepare for war. And then all the MSM messaging. So yeah.
Do you have any idea what this war might look like? What might be the flashpoint other Taiwan, but yes, what it might look like?
There's an interesting article by Financial Times that has just come out recently. And they've essentially mapped out what it might look like. I see that article as largely smoke and mirrors, but they're very, very granular. They're talking about missile warfare, distributed warfare along the islands, using Korea and Japan to fight, all of these things that have been mapped out in air-sea battle and all the other doctrines, they're essentially putting them into place. So the flashpoint, as I said before, could be Taiwan. Flashpoint could be Korea, because Korea is always a flashpoint. And recently, some writers at 38 North, Hecker and Carlin, said that North Korea is preparing imminent war against South Korea. What evidence does he have? He gives none. He says that North Korea has ceased engaging in the diplomatic process for peace with South Korea, and therefore it is going to go to war with the South. Now, there's a long process between disengagement and war, but he says that they're preparing for war. This is in a very important, NatSec journal called 38 North, and he says North Korea has to go to war because it has run out of options. Now, what is he talking about? What does it mean that North Korea has run out of options? It has lots of options before war. And if you look at the actual speech that he quotes, Kim Jong-un is saying we need to develop our economy and do this, that, and the other. This is not the language of somebody preparing for war. But if you understand it that the US is preparing for war against North Korea, then it becomes very clear that it has run out of options, or it will very soon be out of options. And
So they're trying to build a case for preemptive
war. Yes. Yeah. So the accusation is a confession, in my opinion. It's projection. So once again, North Korea could very much be a flashpoint, although North Korea is hedging its bets and tying itself very, very closely to Russia, and it's demonstrating tremendous military deterrent capacity through missiles and satellite launches, etc. So North Korea is not going to be a walkover. It never was, even when it was the poorest, most broken, bleeding country on the planet. It was not a walkover, right? And China over either. None of this is going to be a walkover.
Well, if you look at the U.S. In the Red Sea,
yeah. So
they can't even stop Yemen from doing what they want to do.
Yeah, so they can't defeat the Houthis. They had to retreat from the Houthi attacks.
Yeah.
And I mean, let's go back to Afghanistan. I mean, they essentially lost the war to a dedicated group of people who were previously goat herders wearing sandals, right? So the U.S. does not have a strong track record in war. In fact, you could argue that it hasn't won any wars since World War II. Certainly, the Korean War was not a win, and it was fighting with one of the most powerful military forces on the planet against a bruised and battered and bleeding China, which was one of the poorest countries on the planet at the time. It still was not able to prevail in Korea. So the U.S. really has never won a war, unless you want to count Grenada or Panama, right? These essentially, I mean, those aren't even wars. I mean, those are just.
Well,
but
in your article, you finish up with trying to answer a question: is there any possibility of peace?
Yeah. So I think we always have to believe in the possibility of peace. We cannot not believe. It's a moral duty. Not to despair, and for us to take action. And so if we start from that premise, and we remain, as Gramsci said, optimists of the will, even if we're, pessimists of the intellect, just staying with that kind of optimism, what we do is there's a tremendous amount of education that needs to take place. Okay, we need to point out that this war is senseless. It's madness. The U.S. cannot win this war. The only thing that can happen in this war is that it first turns tactical nuclear and then strategic nuclear, and then we're all done for. That's simply the bottom line. The US cannot win a war against China, certainly not in its home court, not right up against China. That's just not thinkable. It cannot use proxies. It cannot get away with those proxies. Those proxies will be very rapidly depleted, as we also see with the Ukraine right now. So I think that what we have to do is we have to educate, we have to organize, and most importantly, we have to keep our minds from being colonized and occupied by the warmongers. In the doctrine of war that the neocons espouse, they believe that space is a domain of war. And when they talk about space, they're talking about outer space, because it's the ultimate higher ground, satellites and satellite surveillance and even possibly satellite weapons. They also talk about cyberspace as a domain of war, because war is waged through electronic warfare and in cyberspace, and also in information space. And the last, but also the most important area is mental space, right? This is the space where we either think for ourselves and act from our consciences, or we let ourselves be drawn into and entrained into the war trance that the warmongers are manufacturing for us right now. And we simply become entrained and entranced, and we go along with it, and we believe the propaganda. We swallow it hook, line, and sinker. That's the piece where we can individually start to resist, start to think critically, start to challenge the lies. Don't believe the lies. If you don't believe the lies from the MSN about anything else, why should you believe them when they spout them against China? Okay, so start to bring back in your critical thinking, your skepticism, your capacity to analyze and to debunk, and turn your bullshit detector up to, up to 11, because you need it. Because right now we're being barraged with an avalanche of lies. For example, Taiwan is an independent state. Absolute bullshit. Okay, if we go to war over Taiwan, we are waging a war of aggression, because we're interfering in the sovereign internal affairs of another country. So turn your bullshit detector up to 11, 12, 13, and don't fall for the lies, and continue to educate, continue to organize, continue to come together with other groups that are working for peace. And through this continued action, we have to we have to prevent, we have to do everything possible to prevent war. If we do that, we have a chance. If we don't, it's all over. So we're at a very, very critical point in history right now. I believe it's one of the most important moments in human history that we're living through right now.
What's your perspective on if Biden gets reelected or if Trump gets elected? Do you see any difference in their approach?
I don't think so. We're really talking about the national security state, the deep state. I think they have an agenda. It's a preset agenda. There are minor quibbles among them. Even with war with China, there was a quibble whether they were going to attack Russia first and then go to China, that Russia was just going to be an appetizer on the way to China. China was the main dish, or whether they would, attack China first and finish Russia off from the rear, or they would have a two-pronged ambidextrous attack. There were minor quibbles among them, but at the end of the day, there was no dissent from the idea of war. Just like, even as we see this genocide happening, you don't see any difference between the Republicans and the Democrats about the genocide. They're all for it. They're all for the genocide in Gaza. And it's the same thing around war with China. I think you will have minor different flavors. You may have, a small, kind of boutique variations, but the drive to war is the same for both parties. So in that sense, there is no lesser evil. There's simply evil and, more evil. And that's not a good choice for us to
No.
have.
We've kept you for a little over an hour. Is there something that you came into this wanting to make sure you said that you didn't get a chance to say? Because I really think we've just touched the tip of the iceberg here.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, I have been doing this research and journalism for a very long time. And it pains me to constantly be this Cassandra warning against war, and to also notice that even as I do this, the escalation simply seems to go higher and higher. This constant ratcheting up of this escalation to war. And once again, my appeal to people is, do not be suckered by the lies. Exercise your critical thinking. The farther away we are from the truth, the closer we are to war. As we know, in war, the first casualty is truth. And so be very, very careful about the ways in which we are being brainwashed, entrained, entranced into this war trance. And to really, put effort into with others into trying to stop this war machine, because we only get one chance at this. If we fail, that's game over. So I think it's a very, very important moment for us, and I think that I think we're all capable of rising to the occasion, because certainly the ruling imperial elite is not. They would rather see the end of the planet than the end of their privilege and power.
Good Lord. All right. Well, thanks so much for coming back on. It's always enlightening and enlightening, and I know you don't want to be the fear, the merchant of fear, but reality can be fearful, or reality can be scary, and what we are doing, what we are getting ourselves into right now, day after day, dollar after dollar, it's just insane. And so we'll have to this is the first week in June. We'll have to get you back on at least by December.
Probably before that, the right things are going. But anyway, thank you so much for being available. And I just feel like, our listeners, along with us, I think that anytime we have you on the show, I come away with some understanding that just it wasn't there before. And
Yeah.
it's so easy to just feel helpless or focus on what could happen without that bigger picture to understand it in context and how we got to where we are.
Yeah, we have to understand it not simply from the bleachers or from the ground, but also from the box, from the,
Yeah.
we have the, kind of the big picture as well. Once we
Yes.
understand the big picture, then we can understand that we all have a part in challenging and resisting this
Mhm.
drive to war.
Yes.
A war cannot happen unless the vast majority of people are entranced into accepting it. If we resist, both individually and collectively, and refuse the lies, the narratives that are driving us to war, then we have a chance. And that means that everybody who speaks up, who challenges, who writes, who says something against this war, can make a difference.
And thank goodness you're out there promoting that. And like you said, understanding does then give us, while it might scare us, it also gives us the outline on how to take action and how to
Absolutely.
respond.
Absolutely.
So, Oh, where could people? Yeah, I need to ask this. Where can people either find your work or get in touch with you to um, uh, to get your insights? Who knows? Maybe at another presentation. Uh,
Um, they can look for my work. You know, I've been doing a lot of interviews for the Sputnik network, so Critical Hour, the backstory, fault lines, and political misfits. So those are some really, really good news shows. So I actually invite people to tune into those. You can, you know, go online and look up those shows. There's some really, really good hosts and some really good information, kind of stuff that you would expect to get on, you know, if we had like a real media system. And then, you know, and then a lot of other shows as well. And you can also see my writing, johnmenadu.com, MR Online, Counterpunch, Dissident Voice,
Mhm.
anything that's progressive and forward thinking.
Very good. Very good.
Thank you.
All right. We will let you go.
Thank you so much, and always a pleasure.
Oh, for sure. Thanks, KJ. See ya.